Friends. I have Hannah Nieves on the show today, and she's really special to me because we're in a little girl group together where we brainstorm mostly, maybe more than once a month, I would say. We're texting, we're going to be in Miami together. We're just little special friends, and she is a tech founder, a speaker, a podcast host, business advisor, and most importantly, she's a mom. And she is the founder of HN Brands, which is a collective of brands that seek to redefine the way that we live and we work. And she started her career actually in capital markets at Cushman and Wakefield, which is one of the larger commercial real estate development firms. And obviously, she had that thing where she was in corporate and she realized that she is an entrepreneur. And I know that there's a lot of you listening that has probably felt that nudge before. And she's also founder of HN House, which is, and it's HAUS, it's a network and business education platform for multi-passionate women. So we all know, I support a good multi-potentialite here. And I would love to just get into Hannah's zone of genius with personal branding. Y'all know I'm doing TEDx talks written and booked. Hannah knows so much about personal branding I wanted to grab onto. So yeah, just starting there, what got you so with it in the personal branding space?
Ooh, I mean, so much like going back to even like the corporate days of working in the capital markets division too. I was probably one of five women on a sales floor with all men selling buildings, land, and air, and probably the only Latina and the youngest one there. And I had all the things kind of stacked against me. And I quickly realized I was at that point when I had to have a personal brand. I had to stand out with what I was doing to have my voice heard.
Mm.
And that was the starting point. And I've always been fascinated with other personal brands that are out there. So I think like the Barbara Corcorans, the Sarah Blakely's, the Oprahs. And it's like, how do they get to this point where they've articulated who they are, where if they're not in the room, people know who they are and they know their brand. And that's what really lights me up, because I think each and every one of us, when you think about our personal brand, it's like the way that you view the world, but also how the world views you. And I think there is like a beauty and a science to that, of creating what that looks like. And I've always just been really fascinated with like articulating and creating personal brands and then amplifying them through PR. I think it's really powerful.
Mm. I know that press doesn't always mean sales, right? Like press can mean credibility, which can mean sales, right? Like somebody Googles you and they see all this press and then they trust you. Um, what services, let's say there's new entrepreneurs and then there's like
Mm.
medium-sized entrepreneurs, meaning they're paying themselves a real paycheck, they're growing. What services make sense to invest in? You know what I mean? And what makes sense to do yourself, and when? So I would love to start with the new entrepreneur from a personal brand perspective. I would not advise them to pay us 30K to do a TED Talk written book for them, or a TEDx talk. But I know a medium size or a larger size entrepreneur, of course, I think it's a great idea. So where do you begin in helping somebody start to look at themselves and look at what their business is and say, okay, we're going to tackle this and build around it?
And I think, what you had just mentioned, there's so many avenues depending on where you are in your business, and if you're listening to this now and thinking, okay, I'm in the newer phase, it might not make sense to hire a PR agency, which is totally fine. People would look at me with more eyes when I would tell them, you don't need to hire me to do your PR. Like you can actually do this yourself. And my biggest recommendation, if you're newer, is to start to consume content like this, start to plug into, free types of opt-ins and downloads and courses. Like I have a free opt-in called the PR Power Blueprint. I'm happy to give to your audience. It's free. It literally is a framework that helps me refine and elevate personal brands. You can do it yourself. And that's like the first thing. When you think about building your brand online, you want to think about if I go and Google you, what do I find? What do I find on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and all of your social platforms? So that's like a first starting point, is to consume content where you can get access to this. Then from there, then you want to start thinking about, okay, like what are my goals for my business and for my personal brand? So maybe it's launching a product, maybe you're exiting a company and you're shifting into a new era. Maybe you're just getting things off the ground and you're shifting, out of corporate, and starting to think about what those goals are, because then you can backtrack and figure out, okay, like what support do I really need? For some people in your journey, this might just looking like plugging into a community and connecting with like-minded people. This might also look like taking a course, which we have tons of support at HN House, or this looks like hiring someone maybe in a one-to-one capacity that can really like look under the hood with you and help build the plan depending on where you're at. So I feel like there's so many different options depending on where your business is at, but also like what your specific goals are.
I also feel like TV, like I used to have the weirdest thoughts when I didn't have a business. Like I used to look at people on TV and be like, somebody asked them to come on. And sometimes that's the case, but it was such a mind shift for me when I realized, no, entrepreneurs have been clawing and pitching and pushing to get themselves on, or they have PR firms doing that work for them. Um, and it really shifted my perception of like watching the news and thinking, oh, wow, they really just selected that person as the special person versus you can make yourself be the special person. So
Mhm.
early in business, I did a lot of work on personal branding through the perspective of like, how do I get myself on different people's blogs so I can get credibility through being a writer on other platforms? How do I get myself on people's podcasts? How do I get myself
Mhm.
on TV? And I learned that I could pitch myself to TV bookers. I could get on LinkedIn in the advanced search area and find who is the production assistant on set for Anderson Cooper, for today's show, for Good Morning LA. And then I learned, right? Like it's a small, you go with the small hanging fruit until you get
Mhm.
to the high hanging fruit, right? So Good Day LA is going to be easier for me to get than today's show, right? So you work your way up.
Yeah.
And I also learned that those TV interviews, if you secure one, that they go really fast. You need to have your talking points ready. If you give your talking points to the production
Mhm.
person, because I probably sent like 100 emails to TV assistants to get like three TV shows myself. And it was like 5-minute interviews when I was a career coach on like, salary negotiation or whatever. One of them, I gave them my talking points in advance and they used all of them. And then I had no talking points. Like I did all this
Oh.
research about salary negotiation and da 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 da. So you never really know what the media is going to do, and you have to think quickly on your feet.
Yeah.
But what I learned from like a personal branding perspective is like, I don't need 20 TV interviews. Like once you have 5 or 10, you kind of just like put them in your materials. And I remember after the first one thinking, oh my gosh, are the floodgates opening that I was on Good Day LA this morning? Like, are all these coaching
Mhm.
clients coming to find me? And the answer was no, not so much. Like, that's not going to do it. So there's the credibility piece, and then there's like client acquisition and getting customers. Can you talk a little bit
Mhm.
about like how do people start to think about their credibility by themselves if they're wanting to put some things on the calendar this week to start to say, all right, I listened to Ashley and Hannah. I'm going to start doing this thing to build my credibility as a new entrepreneur. What would be because I mean, those are just
Absolutely.
some of my low hanging fruits that I did.
Which I think is incredible, the fact that you put yourself out there 100 times and stayed consistent with it, because that's where I think a lot of people fall off. So when you think about, if you're a newer business owner and you're wanting to get that credibility and authority out there, start with your own content. And I say own in quotations because we don't own our social media content, but own the content where you own the narrative. So whether it's your social media content, your email, your blog, whatever it is, and how you communicate to your audience that way. And there's different ways of doing this, right? Like there's that know, like, and trust factor that we all talk about and hear about when it comes to content, but share social proof, share case studies. People want to know that what you're doing is going to provide some type of ROI. So don't be afraid to share the work behind what you're doing there. So that's your own content. And this could also look like your podcast as well. Then you have your earned content. So this is like the TV placements, getting on podcasts, speaking, you know, getting in digital and print, where this maybe takes a little bit more of your effort, but is also really helpful. And there's tools out there that you can plug into, like Harrow, Help a Reporter Out. It's completely free. You get 3 emails a day. There's Quoted. There's other platforms out there where you can see what journalists are looking for. But if you want to do the old school way of pitching yourself, you build a media list and you set time on your calendar every single week where it's like, okay, I have an hour a week. During this hour, I'm going to connect with 5 to 10 new people or 5 to 10 new podcasts. Start small, then build from there. Because I think a lot of people, when they think about PR, authority, visibility, it becomes really overwhelming on top of everything else. Like you're becoming the salesperson, the executor, the marketer in your business. Start with one goal. And maybe that one goal is I want to get on 10 podcasts in the next quarter. Great. Let that be the intention behind what you do every single week.
Mm, this is really good because there's structure in it. And I feel like structure guarantees momentum. It's like I used to hate discipline, and it wasn't until my master's in spiritual psychology that the head of the program coached me and said, "Why do you hate discipline?" And I was talking about snack accidents and eating and how, like, I just love cupcakes and I hate being on a diet and I'm staring at my salad wishing it was a fucking cupcake. You know what I mean? And he was like, "Well, what happens if you eat a lot of cupcakes?" And I was like, "Well, and I'm like overweight and sick. I feel sick. It makes me inflamed. I can't think." Da, da, da. And it was then that he showed me that discipline is freedom, that the discipline to not eat all the cupcakes is what gives me the freedom to have one sometimes and enjoy it. Right. So
Yeah.
I think that the momentum you're talking about through creating structure is so powerful. And I love the one thing focus. I've always wanted to read that book, The One Thing, and I just haven't had
Hmm.
the full time. I think it's the same publisher as me, maybe, but
Hmm.
um, yeah, I've always thrived when I focus on one thing. And so I think
Hmm.
podcasts are still so potent for your business. What are some things that you would recommend somebody needing to have nailed down before they pitch themselves to be on a bunch of podcasts? Because I know that for some people, it's not that entertaining, it's not that interesting. I hate to be that honest, you know what I mean? But we all know that sometimes we stop listening if we're not engaged, and you don't want to be the guest that people are tuning out. So,
Hmm.
what are some things people should consider before they take that leap and really put that focus on their structured time every week of getting on shows or even having their own show?
Well, first off, having your own show, that's a whole different conversation, which I love because I have my own podcast as well. You do. And there's so much benefit to that, which we can talk about. But when it comes to making sure that you're prepared, especially if you haven't been on a lot of podcasts yet, number one is you want to have your platforms optimized. So again, when I search you, what comes up on Google, what comes up on LinkedIn, especially LinkedIn, I don't care if you haven't touched your LinkedIn in 10 years and you worked in corporate America, it's going to come up probably second, So you want to make sure your LinkedIn's updated. And I want to make sure that if I look at all of your platforms, I know exactly who you are, how you help me, and your expertise. I should know that within the first few seconds of looking at your platform. And there's different, finite ways of optimizing them depending on what platform you're on. That's number one. The second thing you want to do is make sure you have these talking points, or at least, again, like for me, I feel like I talk about so many different things, but there's always this through line of like personal branding and PR and business growth. But think about like, what are those top three things that you could riff on and talk about all the time? I think that's a big point as well. And then from there, this is kind of like an extra point to think about is if you do have some speaking engagements and or been on podcasts, create a speaking page on your website. Take the extra time to put that together because it really is helpful to see like what a speaker has done prior to coming on. And then if you're saying, Hannah, I've never even been on a podcast, that's okay. We all start somewhere. Start to do live streams on Instagram or LinkedIn. Those are fantastic ways of practicing speaking, even if it's just an audio, connecting in front of a camera, because it really is important if you're going to pitch yourself, especially to maybe established podcasts that you are comfortable talking. You're comfortable talking about your zone of genius. And this just takes time and practice at the end of the day.
That's so good. I think, one of the things I've learned when it comes to like this idea of being able to talk about something nonstop is like a lot of people don't feel like they have something they can talk about nonstop because maybe they just haven't been in that mastery yet. As a speaker, and I think I'm just so in speaker land with 32 TEDx
Mhm.
talks right now, but I call it bits and bobs. I think somebody's called it that before. That's not my term, but it's like I have bits and bobs. I have like little stories, little mind shifts, little talking points that are pops in
Mhm.
conversations, right? So, and sometimes I discover them based on how people respond. So I was just on another podcast and she was talking to me about customer service, and I was telling her that I've been questioning what does really good customer service mean? And I realized what it means is not necessarily over delivering or giving like new things that you didn't agree to in your contract, but actually just delivering impeccably in what you said you were going to do.
Mhm.
And that's been a mind shift for me because I've had a couple clients in the TEDx land where, because it's a high end offer, they sometimes expect free things like, "Hey, can we do a 1 hour strategy call?" And I'm like, "No, my schedule's full."
Mhm.
And I've had to go through this like identity crisis of like, am I worthy of these high end clients if I'm not willing to do these hour, you know, calls that I didn't agree to? I realized no, for me, good customer service is not giving them free calls and stuff like that. And not that I'm a nickel or a dimer, but it's more like I don't have the capacity for that. I have the capacity to deliver in spades on what I said I would deliver, better than anybody else they're going to get it from. And I have full confidence in that. So to
Mhm.
me, I've had to ask these questions. My little share here about customer service, I've just realized is a bit and a bob. It's a thought that I've had about entrepreneurship that a podcast host responded very well to me about. They're like, wow, that's a really good mind shift. That's a really good thought about it. And so I think it's these things that you learn through conversations with people, and you have to
Mhm.
start paying attention when somebody says, "Oh, wow, that's really useful. Oh, wow, that's really valuable." That's a bit and a bob. So yeah,
Love
I
that.
think some people don't have those like long-term deep roots in their topics. Um, what do you recommend for people to start to develop that sense of conversational mastery? Because maybe there's some new entrepreneurs that can make good on what they're offering, but they haven't become advanced storytellers. They don't know how to build their brand through being compelling or interesting yet.
Mm. And this is something too. So actually coming like when it comes to speaking specifically, I actually had a fear of speaking for many years, going back to like burnout, starting my business. I became really sick, had a fear of getting sick in front of people, the whole nine.
Hmm.
And that was my starting point. And I'm sure this probably resonates with some people that are listening in too. Not everyone is a natural speaker when you first start out getting on podcasts or speaking in front of people. And that is okay. I think just like first off, releasing the pressure around that is key. When it comes to actually like creating that mastery and practicing, like I said, starting with your own platforms is key. Before you go and start to like pitch yourself to other media or speaking or even TEDx too, right? Like own the platforms that you're on, right? So you can perfect those conversations. And one thing that I did that I thought was really helpful in the beginning was I launched a podcast in the beginning of my business journey, but I also launched an IG Live workshop and I would host different guests from all different types of backgrounds, walks of life. And that is how I practiced before I landed any big speaking engagements. I was interviewing people beforehand, and it was a great way to hold conversation, ask proper questions, and things like that from the interviewer standpoint, but also as a guest too. So I think doing live streams, practicing, if you're also like in mastermind groups or group programs of any capacity, don't be afraid to raise your hand and even like ask, hey, like, can we do like a mock one-to-one where like you interview me and I'm responding back to you? Like, there's so many different ways that you can plug into the resources that you have. And I think it's just also taking the ego out of thinking, okay, like I have to be perfect from day one. No one is perfect from day one at the end of the day. I've made so many mistakes myself. I'm sure you have as well when it comes to speaking, and you just learn and you perfect and you tweak. And then you get to the point where you hire a company like yours, speaking coach, that can really help you perfect those talks in a way where they can amplify it in such a bigger way. But you also have to start somewhere small, and that's okay too.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love the mock interview, the mock conversations. I think people kind of shy away from that because they feel cheesy, like pretending. But it's
Mhm.
like, dude, like check your ego at the door. This is so important for you to get the words in your cells of what you're going to say, to have that flow, to have that cadence. Nothing looks worse when you're speaking on a stage than fumbling and bumbling to find your words in your brain. And
Mhm.
when you've mocked it and you've trialed it, it's kind of like they're on the tip of your tongue in such a better way.
Yeah.
I also think like, not everybody's meant to be doing podcast interviews. So from a personal brand perspective, that might not be the thing. I've also found that curation is really important. Like you might not be a content creator, but you can go read 25 books and become a master curator where you can
Mhm.
pull from the bodies of 25 different types of work. And instead of having your own take on things, you can say, well, this is what this person thinks, and this is what this person thinks. Here's what I think about what everybody thinks, based on what I've read. I think that that alone makes you very valuable as a content
Mhm.
provider. So there's many different ways to become content rich and to be generous with what you know.
Mhm.
Let's say somebody's like, you know what? I'm not a conversationalist. Podcasting sounds like a bad time for me. What's another personal branding move that you think is really important?
And this brought up a really great point that you just said. I think a lot of people think that you need to put yourself in a box with what this looks like, whether it's, okay, I have to get on podcasts or I have to get on TV, whatever that is. And I think you also need to take a step back and take a look at what platforms or mediums work best for me. Like you said, maybe having these conversations on audio or video are not your jam. And that's okay too. Maybe you prefer to write. I have some clients that are, avid writers and they love to do bylines and contributor articles and things like that. So maybe that works better in your favor. And this could look like guest blogging, opportunities, contributor article opportunities for platforms, writing, ghost writing in some capacity. But these are great ways. Like I was just talking to a client today that has a magazine, and we're talking about getting contributors on there to help publish content on that magazine, So things like that, where you can plug in, where it might not necessarily mean that you need to get on a stage of 10,000 people or talk on a podcast, but still gives you that impact where you're getting that piece of work in front of thousands or millions of people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I love about TEDx. It's like, I did 700 blog posts for Forbes, and none of them got me the amount of business or opportunity that one 12-minute talk did. So when I think about how like 2 months of the
Yeah.
past 15 years I devoted to like preparing for TEDx, and then I think about all the hours I put into all the blog posts I wrote, it's insane. It's like this
Mhm.
80/20 ROI thing could not be more important. Okay, so let's take even a step back and get into identity with personal brand, because some people are like, what does that even mean? Like I'm a life coach, let's say, and I'm like, or I'm a tennis coach. What do I think about in order to create my personal brand? One part of it is going out and doing things and creating a personality on the internet, but some people are like, what is my personality? Who am I? And like,
Mhm.
how do we even help them think about that?
So one of the things I think about when you're thinking about your personal brand, I mentioned this earlier, is it's this perception of how you view the world, but also how the world views you. So when you're thinking about who you are, like taking your profession out of the equation for a second, what are your values? What is your intention here, or purpose here? What do you want to be known for? And not just known for like, hi, I am Hannah, the business advisor, and this is what I do. Like, what are the values associated with what you do? How did you actually impact the world with your work? And it doesn't have to be that big, but thinking about, okay, what's your own personal vision and mission statement? What are the values associated with you? How do you want to be viewed? What are the words? One of the questions I ask my personal brand questionnaire when I work with clients is like, what are the words that you want to be associated with your brand from a visual perspective? What are other brands or entities that you align with from an inspirational standpoint? What are the colors that you want to be associated? Like all of these micro pieces, even down to the visual perspective of like fonts and colors and your brand imagery, all create this perception of who you are,
Yeah.
right? And I think the beautiful thing about it is that this is naturally going to change as you grow. So I think starting there is a foundational point. And then thinking about, going back to say like the tennis coach, right? Thinking about if you're a tennis coach, how do you do things differently? Like, what's your perspective of tennis and how you're doing this with clients and things like that? Because your own perception and or your own beliefs of how you do your business are going to influence the way that you create content, the way that you create your personality. And, I always use the example of like, there's tons of people that do PR, right? Like, I'm not the only one. There's a lot of people that do marketing out there, right? But what makes me different? It's my perspective. It's my viewpoint on how we do those things, right? And I think that's all shaped into how you communicate, how your brand shows up visually, and just like the sensory experience that you create when someone interacts with your brand. And that's something too that I also love talking about was like the sensory component of how you communicate your brand to your clients. I think that's huge.
Mm. There's so many different people that will like do fun little exercises. Like if you were an animal, what kind would you be?
Yeah.
Or like three, I don't know. I just pulled that out of my ass, and I don't know if that's like a real, I think that's an exercise. But like,
It might be.
if you could describe your energy, how would you describe it? So I think one thing people are afraid of is they don't want to put a persona out that isn't actually who they are. And I know that there's just like so much pressure more than ever to feel like we need to like create something interesting and stimulating. And I was talking to my boyfriend the other day. I was like, man, it's so damaging that we live in an economy where for influencers, like your livelihood, your income is directly tied to the amount of likes and views. And your views and your likes are often not just tied to your content and how genius you are, but how you look. It's like it can be so tough on our self-esteem, our mindset.
Mhm.
So how do you stay you? Like what are some tips when from a publicity standpoint? And also when you're, playing the PR game, there's a lot of games, right? It's a lot of like networky stuff. So you're so authentic. Like, how do you be that way, Hannah? And like, I know I'm asking you 14 questions, but pick whichever one
I
you want.
love it. Well, when it comes to authenticity, which I think this is something that I talked about before, but I don't want to say a big trend in 2024, but people are just craving it. Like, people have been burned before in the past in the business world, online world specifically too, and people are just craving authenticity in the way that you show up and you market yourself at the end of the day. However, how do you actually do that, right? And I've always followed this principle of I will consume less than I am teaching and or giving value online. And I think it's just a principle because if you get into the cycle of consuming more than you're actually teaching and educating, right? Then the imposter syndrome starts to happen. Then you're starting to question, should I do this? Should I do that? And then you start to take so many external opinions that then now your business and or your vision starts to change.
Right.
And I can't tell you how many times that has happened to people, clients, myself, where you start to look at, wait, I'm actually out of alignment with what I'm doing. And I think going back to how do you stay authentic, it's really having a deep sense of intuition
Yeah.
and also knowing when you are acting out of alignment in your business and the way that you're showing up. I'll give the example of, if you're not like a pantsuit wearing type of person, that's just like not your style or your brand, don't go and do a brand photo shoot that is pantsuit wearing and super corporate. If that's not your brand, that's okay. I think you have to find like what makes your brand unique, whether it's like your humor, the type of imagery that you have, maybe you're really witty, in your copy, thinking about who you are and what makes you unique, I think is really important, but also having the intuition. And then the last piece I will say is also having people who are like-minded in your network that are not afraid to check you when they know that you're out of alignment. And it's
Yeah.
finding like those key people that really see you. And I'll just say, I have some really close friends. Actually, my best friend who's in the industry too, who is not afraid to tell me, Hannah, what was that post? That's not you,
Mhm.
And it's like, sometimes you just need that check and that, kind of kick in the tail to really say like, wait a second, am I doing this because this is going to help grow from an audience perspective or hit whatever type of milestone? Or am I doing this because this is actually authentic with who I am?
Oh God, yeah. It's interesting. I have a lot of friends that will call me out for real. And they will come to me struggling when they have a friend that they can't call out. Like, oh, this person's out of integrity and I love them and I'm watching it and it's killing me to watch it.
Mhm.
So it's so important to like, I mean, ultimately we're going to bed by ourselves at night or next to someone, but in our own heads, we're having our own little thoughts and we got to like ourselves, and it can be really slippery. I also feel so much empathy for content creators, myself included, because it's really hard to stay unicorn in what you're doing. Like you can have like my book U-Turn. That thing was like a portal of information that came through me over 10
Mhm.
years.
Wow.
And it's like I didn't have much to say after that. People are like, "When's your next book?" I'm like, "I have nothing to say." I already can feel life is giving me more to say. Life is giving me more
Yeah.
experiences, but right now, this is all I got going. So I guess what I'm most curious about is, I don't know, like how people in your head, if they want to get a lot of PR, how do they stay relevant and not get into the pressure of constantly having something new? I love this idea of like one thing, new eyeballs,
Mhm.
one keynote speech, 500 different audiences for it. One
Mhm.
pitch for the media, 500 different TV shows to see it. Keeping it quality, it's interesting. Also, like I've seen some people, I know I'm rambling, on podcasts and they've had judgment, like, oh, they're the same on every podcast. I'm like, well, that just means they're bringing their best content to the table. Like, I don't want them to be different on every podcast if it means that they're not experienced or thoughtful in the content that they're offering. So I'm never sad about it. But yeah, I don't know what your take is on that. But how do people, I don't know, stay original and resonate when they're pursuing PR?
When it comes to PR specifically, I think this is one thing too. I mentioned before the fact that your brand is always evolving means that you are evolving too. And I think it's one thing, right? Like, say, for example, you're the expert in tennis coaching, right? Or marketing, whatever that is. Not to say that those topics or the things or the ethos of your brand are going to change drastically, but they might, right? And like I'll give you an example. A lot of the talks that I do are around this visibility and personal branding, but I'm also a new mother. And so motherhood has completely changed the way that I look at business and life and the way that I operate, and it's put a different lens. And now that's becoming a topic and a lens I talk about now, from my own personal perspective. When it comes to staying relevant, I think this is where, again, the ego check is going to come through, because it's so easy to get caught up in like keeping up with the Joneses and having to constantly be in this hamster wheel and rat race of like doing the next thing. And I think just like honoring the season that you're in is key. And as someone who is, considered like a high achiever, and I've had to do a lot of ego work myself and a lot of healing, I feel like we all do as entrepreneurs, right? That was probably one of the biggest things I had to lean into, especially on mat leave, because I'm always the type of person that's always like, okay, like what's next? I'm excited about what's next. But for the first time, I had to stop completely. And I think that's one thing. It's just like removing the ego of always having to do the next thing. But when it comes to staying relevant, I definitely think just quality over quantity, right? Like you don't have to be everywhere to be really intentional. Like for example, over the course of the last few years, we've done some incredible things, been featured in like NASDAQ and Forbes, Insider, went to Necker Island, spoke at these really cool places, all the things. But remember, these things can compound. And even though you did that TEDx talk, 2 years ago, it's still relevant. It just depends on how you use that content and how you bring it into the content that you own. Like I said, that earned content. So there's ways of repurposing what you've been doing and referencing it. And I'll give you like a micro example of this. So for example, I might be on social media talking about maybe a lesson of what I took away from Necker Island, or maybe a lesson from my speaking engagement that I did with entrepreneurs organizations, sharing about the insights from whatever, right? And I take that micro example of the lesson that I have, and now I've just made it relevant again, even though I haven't done that in, say, a year and a half ago. So there's ways to keep your PR alive, even though it's been done, in the past.
So useful. And I think the permission to be in your seasons is so powerful, because people who don't want to be in their seasons will keep grabbing onto things that aren't really for them. And then they're in something worse than a hard season of transition. They're in a season of doing things they don't even want to do because they're in denial about their transition. So it's a season on top of your season. And it's almost like creating more work for yourself. When you think about somebody who has really good PR, has a really good brand, what are some services that they've invested in your perspective? Like, let's say you look at Ashley Stahl, over here. She's got it going on, that Ashley girl. What would you say, like, are the spokes of her PR wheel that are all in sync over the past 15 years of her career that make it look to you, as a PR perspective, like she's done her PR diligence and respect for her brand?
So going back to the services, we'll start there. In terms of what you will need to invest in or invest. Now, keep in mind, you could do this yourself, right? But also time is money. So you do need to make investments, which is okay. And there's different levels and different types of ways that you can make those investments. But typically when someone is at the point, where they're leveraging PR, I typically see they've invested in their visual identity. So whether it's, having a creative brand shoot, and it doesn't have to be every single quarter or month, it could be twice a year, having some type of refresh imagery, Brandon Webb, some type of personal messaging that is baked out and across all of your platforms. Like I said, they might have invested in a PR agency, freelancer, or some type of support to bring this in-house. And typically when I'm getting to the point of working with clients in their refresh branding, right, or personal branding, they're typically preparing to either hire someone like your agency for a TED Talk, hire another, like a speaking coach, to really up-level their speaking career, right? So they're thinking about, okay, what's the foundation that I have set? And then how do I amplify it? And that's where they hire your type of agency to do that. Now, as far as like the spokes to what your PR looks like, this is going to change. And, I kind of umbrella, when you think about PR, is like the nucleus there: digital and print media, events, PR, influencer marketing, which now is kind of bucketed under PR. You have internal and external communication. What else? Affiliates, and
Can you
then
define
crisis
some of
management.
these? Like, what does it look like when
Yeah.
somebody does influencer marketing, internal and external communications? Like, walk me through the spokes of it. Because I know a lot of people, this might be their first time looking at PR as like a wheel with
Mhm.
all these spokes.
Yeah. So when you think about digital and print, obviously those are pretty self-explanatory, podcasting and events. When you think about influencer marketing, right? And this can look like a product brand that's looking to get their product out there, and they need to tap into micro or macro influencers to help promote their product, right? And a lot of brands, this is what I did on the corporate side too, when I was with a national home interiors brand, where we would work with a lot of influencers in the New York area to get the product out there. And this is a great way if you don't want to do traditional ad placements or in addition to that. So influencer marketing, fantastic. When you think about internal, external communication, and this is obviously as your business is growing, but I'll give you an example of how we do this for our brand. I have my brand experience manager, Marina. And so with her role, she is the brand experience manager for any internal communication that's happening, right? So knowing that every team member knows what's happening, any projects that are coming up, but also external. So she is the external relation with our clients as well. And this is really important because it creates this experience for your clients. Crisis management, I hope that none of you have to deal with this, but it does happen. But this is where, from a PR perspective, when things go wrong, it's damage control. How do you fix and or mediate a reputation that might be damaged from something? And this can happen. I've seen it happen before. Thankfully, not so much, but there are people and or PR agencies that are dedicated just to crisis management as well.
Mm, so interesting. And when you think about PR, personal branding, I really am so proud of what we're doing with TEDx. What do you think are some other services that would be really powerful for people to invest in today?
Mm. Definitely making sure that you have, I mean, you don't need a website necessarily, but I think having a home for all this to live is really powerful. If you're going to do a TED Talk, if you're going to do any type of PR, right? Like this is top of funnel. You're bringing all that traffic to your home. Now, I know some people might disagree and think you don't need a website, which is totally fine. But if you want to make speaking a career, if you want to write a book, if you want to do other things outside of maybe your craft and your service, having a home for yourself is really key. So definitely leveraging your own personal brand website, investing in that. And this is what I do with clients. So I will help them from the personal brand strategy to their own messaging strategy to their marketing and rollout offer suite. I have someone in the real estate industry right now who just signed on, and they're looking to do really incredible things in their industry. But now we're thinking about how do I leverage the personal brand to do that? Right. So you need a plan, you need a strategy to get yourself there. And then we loop in the right contractors, the right agencies to come in and actually execute the branded web, the creative direction on the photo shoot, and things like that, that create the visual representation of what you're trying to create.
Mm,
And then I would say in the last part of this too, when you think about on the PR side of things or content side of things, is you could hire a PR agency, freelancer, and or marketer that's either external to you or internal. And then you can hire, for example, like someone like myself who will help train and guide your team to actually execute this for you within your existing business.
mm, mm. Hannah, what have I not asked you about PR? And what does everybody need to know before we go?
I think the biggest thing is, like I said, checking your ego at the door. You're going to get a lot of no's. You're going to get people who might not respond, and that's okay. And I think a lot of people, we think like, okay, I sent out 20 emails and I haven't heard anything, or I've only heard one response. That means it's bad or wrong. And that's not the case. This takes time. And I think this is where a lot of people get frustrated with pitching themselves, is it does take time and effort and resources. And just know that even if you get a no or a not now, it doesn't mean it's a never. And what I will say, and my final note on this, is you need to build authentic relationships at the end of the day. It can't just be feature my brand. My brand is so great. It needs to be, how am I giving value and building those authentic relationships? I'll give you an example of one of my really close friends. She's a client of mine who joined my mastermind. I met her 4 years ago because I commented on her Instagram post. She's a very well-known journalist and writer, love and respect her so much. And we just became so like close, and we built such a great relationship. And I think, when you build authentic relationships, it pays back tenfold, but you have to be authentic in how you nurture those relationships. It's not just like a one way or one-sided, approach.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost like agendas, like people can smell agendas, and we don't want to underestimate that and how much you don't enjoy having one, and people don't enjoy. And it's okay to have an agenda in a neutral sense where, like, okay, you have a plan and you're clear about it. But I think the manipulation side of it, it's interesting. A PR firm just this morning, they were like, we really want you to have this client on, and we think that she wants to do a TEDx talk. So for my agency, my responsibility is to take the sales calls. And when I
Mhm.
did the interview, I was like, she doesn't really want to do a TEDx talk. And that's okay. It's just that our podcast doesn't need extra guests right now. And so it's like, oh, I felt that agenda, you know what I mean, of them getting
Yeah.
their client placed. And it wasn't good for the relationship capital that we're building with each other. Because now when I see their next pitch, I'm not going to take it. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think that it's like having love in your heart for the people in your life and not bringing more people in your life that you can't give the love to. And love doesn't have to look like tying up all your time. It's just thoughtfulness, and care. So where can
Mhm.
everybody find you, work with you, all that jazz?
Ooh, so I'm over on Instagram, Hannah Nieves, and the H and House podcast. You can find me on there. I'm usually sharing about the day-to-day of being an entrepreneur and even my sauna that I just bought. So, just all the things mixed with business. So you can find me over there. And any support that you need, whether it's PR, personal branding, marketing, if I can help you, great. If I can't help you, I will find a resource for you, whether free or paid. Just send me a DM.
Ah, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.